If you could time travel, where would you go?
I'd love to be able to spend 3 or 4 days safely moving through there and seeing things and watching them and engaging with the sights and smells other than, the feces and things.
I would destroy the time machine and refuse to get in it.
Buckle up, because Time Bandits is next on Historians at the Movies podcast. All right, and welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. Each week we're bringing you leading historians and scholars to talk about our favorite films and why they matter. I'm your host, Jason Herbert, creator of Historians of the Movies, allegedly the longest running watch party on the internet. Joining us tonight to talk about Time Bandits are two scholars who are stuck in the past. The medieval past, that is. David Perry writes informed commentary and features for outlets like CNN, The Nation, and The Washington Post. He has a PhD in history from the University of Minnesota and is the co-author of The Bright Ages, a new single-volume history of the Middle Ages. Matthew Gabriele is a professor of medieval studies and chair of the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. He is a historian of the medieval Europe and scholar of nostalgia for the Middle Ages. He is also the co-author of The Bright Ages, a new history of medieval Europe. Gentlemen, welcome to HATM.
Hey, thanks, Jason.
Yeah, great to be here.
I've just got a very simple, easy to answer question for you to start, which is, what are the Middle Ages?
Yeah, easy and simple. I'm going to let Matt take that one.
Yeah, the joke that medievalists like to tell is that if you put 10 medievalists in a room and you ask them what the Middle Ages are, if you like to define the chronological boundaries or what's important there, you're going to get 10 different answers.
Or 12.
And I think that's, actually that's probably fair. And then somebody's going to say there's no medieval Europe at all. David and I, as scholars of medieval Europe, when we were thinking about and setting out to work on The Bright Ages, our recent book, is that we really had to think kind of deeply about that, as we had to define these two really problematic terms, both medieval and Europe, because those seem to be self-explanatory to a lot of people, especially in the popular imagination, but they're really kind of problematic both in the contemporary world, but also in the pre-modern world that we're particularly interested in. So, just to give kind of a rough sense, is that it's a period that encompasses something after what popularly is thought of as the kind of the quote unquote fall of Rome. So we start like in the third, or probably more in the 4th century, and then we go until either what has been called the Renaissance or the Reformation. Now, what we like to do as medievalists, and I think most medievalists like to do, is problematize and make those boundaries, both at the beginning and the end, very fuzzy, to suggest maybe, Rome maybe didn't really fall. It just kind of transformed into something very different. And those kind of great reawakenings that we talk about as the Renaissance and the Reformation, maybe they're just kind of continuations of things that have been going on for quite some time across both Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. So the Middle Ages is a whole lot of things. I mean, problematizing it even more is that, we're talking about, a Europe that has not as long been thought kind of closed off. So we're not just talking about Europe, we're talking about North Africa, we're talking about the Middle East, and especially in the later medieval period, contacts with Asia, and even in some cases, kind of sub-Saharan Africa.
And, we know as historians that all periods are fundamentally fictions. And that's not necessarily a criticism of the idea of periodization, in that sometimes fictions are important and useful. Like, you have to write a first page of the book and the last page of the book and decide what it is. Or if you're a teacher, you have to decide what your boundaries are. You only have 15 weeks. So we have to work with these fictions all the time. And I'm happy to do it. But I really think it's important to emphasize that they are fictions, that this idea of periods on a meta level is something that we fabricated for good or bad, or non-moral reasons. I mean, we fabricate them for a lot of different reasons, and they do a lot of different kinds of work.
Your new book is called The Bright Ages. I'd heard you talk a little bit about this, about the idea that maybe you're pushing back against other notions. It's very, I think often we talk about the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, these terms that get pushed to describe this period, this region, and I'm going to go ahead and assume that, this name, The Bright Ages, was not chosen on a whim.
No. That's right. I mean, that's actually been a title that's been kicking around my head for well over a decade. And one day Matt texted me from London. He was at an exhibit in which he had saw all this wonderful stuff, and then there were a bunch of books on the European Middle Ages, general books he didn't like, and so he texted me and said we should write one, and I texted him back almost immediately and said, and we're going to call it the Bright Ages. We focus on brightness as kind of knowability, not as good, but as knowable, as visible, as in color, as human. And, because there's a lot of things you can say about that, but because this is sort of a movie podcast, the Middle Ages in the movies are dark, like literally dark, run through blue filters. That new movie that just came out called Medieval, which is a terrible name. But like, if you just watch the 2.5-minute trailer, everything is run through a blue filter. And there is this idea that people think that's how the Middle Ages looked. It was dark. It was blue. It was grim all the time. And, it was dark when the lights were out, and but the grass was green under the sun, and it was as human as any other time period. So we're really trying to push back at this very long running idea of darkness.
And I think that one of the problems that we're always confronting, right, is that darkness means, as David said, it's, the term actually came from a sense of unknowability, is that there was a perception in the historiography that there weren't a lot of sources. And so, whereas in Roman antiquity, we had lots of texts, we had lots of material culture, and so it was easier to kind of know something. It was a period shrouded in that was fundamentally unknowable. It was shrouded in darkness, right? But it also, in the popular imagination, oftentimes came both in the 19th and 20th century, and then even in the 21st. The darkness means bad, right? It's just kind of unrivaled brutality. As the showrunners of Game of Thrones, like fantasy medieval, which plays off this, this idea of the period, House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, and stuff like that. It's a period of sexual violence. It's a period of rampant kind of misogyny and stuff like that. Like, yeah, it was that, but there were also, these moments of other things that we can talk about.
And we're not saying that there wasn't sexual violence and other kinds of violence in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't more violent than any other particular period. And medieval Europe was not more violent than other periods. I mean, go read Thucydides, right? And, killing an entire island population of that dared to defy Athens, right? This is part of violence, is part of history. Sexual violence is part of history, as are resistance to and other ideas about how we might organize society. So that's really, we're just trying to tell a human story with all the complexities of the human condition.
When I reached out to both of you about doing this particular pod, traditionally I say, hey, whatever you want to talk about, whatever film you want to do. And I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be awesome. We're going to do one of the Robin Hoods. We're going to do a great Crusade thing and so forth. And you both came to me and said, Time Bandits. And I said, awesome, pretending that I knew what the hell you were talking about, because I did not. I had heard of the film.
You're so young. You're so young.
I know. It is a really old film, though, David. I mean, like, it came out in 1981. So
I know, but I watched it with my daughter, who was 13, in preparation for this pod, and she loved it. So I was afraid she wasn't going to love it. I was going to lie to you, but in fact, she really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'd heard of the film before. Ended up watching it on an extremely bumpy flight from Baltimore into Fort Lauderdale last night. And the question I have for you is, why did you make me watch this movie? What made you choose Time Bandits over every other film ever?
So in 1981, I was 9. I mean, I assume I saw it in the theater. I don't actually remember, but we didn't have streaming services. We barely had VCRs, and Time Bandits certainly wasn't. We didn't have Blockbuster Video, right? So I assume we went and saw it in the theater. My brother who's much older than me, was a big Monty Python fan, and Monty Python, it's not a Monty Python movie, but it is a Monty Python movie in every way but branding. And so I'm sure I went with him, and I've kind of been thinking about the film ever since, and I've certainly seen it many times since then. But it's just one of those things you watch as a kid that stays with you, at least for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, I was just a little bit younger. I was 6 when it came out, because David's older than me, and I want on the internet for posterity that David is older than me.
And wiser.
I didn't say that. But anyway, but I think one of the things that's interesting about it, because it's like a super weird film. Like, again, I rewatched it again like last night, and my wife, who had I think seen it like a long time ago but didn't really remember, she, like, at various points, like, I could see her face just kind of twisting and like just what is actually happening right now. It's the thing that I kind of loved about it, and I think that kind of has stayed with me, is how it takes the child protagonist, the main, kind of the main character, the kid, it takes him seriously. Like, he's the one who drives the narrative forward. And there was like things like Labyrinth and stuff like that, which came out around the same time. Like, also similar, though, the age people were a little bit older, and that the protagonist, Jennifer Connelly, was a little bit older than that. But it still takes the child seriously, and that the knowledge that this kid has about history is something that allows him kind of the freedom of this exploration, that whereas everybody else is kind of confused about what's going on, he's the one who sees a little bit clearly about, the tricks that the evil person, the Evil is the name of the person, is playing, and also his kind of cohort of these terrible robbers who have stolen a map of time from God, effectively.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, there's a young kid who goes off with six robbers who stole a map from God. Just to make sure you did hear Matt correctly, that is and Evil wants the map, and the robbers are played by little people, and actually in prepping for this, I reached out to some. I've done a lot of work in the disability community as a writer and continue to. And I reached out to some of my friends in that community, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we love that film." Little people saying that because they're characters, they're given fully fleshed out character roles. They're human. They were paid well for their work. This is just as they love Willow. Which, again, my friends in the dwarfism community want more movies like that, but where they have personalities are not just objects. And boy, do those six have personalities in this film.
It's also, I think one of the things I love about it too is how it kind of rampages through history, right? Because they visit Mycenae, kind of ancient, kind of kind of classical Greece. They're in the Middle Ages. There's, they meet Robin Hood. They meet Napoleon at one point. They're on the Titanic, and then, in a really interesting twist, which I totally forgot about, even though it's really important to they go to this place called the Age of Legends, where it's within time, but it's like there's these mythological creatures that they have to kind of confront, and that's where evil dwells and things like that. So it's just, the way that it manages to move very quickly, but really give you a full sense of how they thought about these different historical periods, I thought was really great.
And it's funny. There's a lot of funny lines, yeah.
Yeah, well, the lines themselves were sharp lines I wasn't really expecting, just kind of watching into it. But maybe I should have, considering that very real Monty Python influence on the film. You can't, you watch this film and you very much feel Holy Grail, Life of Brian kind of all over the film. And certainly you recognize a lot of the faces.
And just so people know, that this is Terry Gilliam, who is the animator, right? And he wanted to make... He kind of talks about them as a triplet. He actually wanted to make Brazil first, but that was too weird. And he couldn't get funding for Brazil. So then he made this one, and then he made Brazil, and then he made The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which is another good film to talk about.
Yeah.
And he sees them as kind of as a set of these weird, not quite our worlds, but with commentaries on different things about age and about childhood and about the government and about individuality and all these other. He's got kind of a meta commentary, which if you really wanted to write, a film studies article on, you probably could, but I don't, because that's not my field. I just want to enjoy it.
Well, and about consumerism too, right? Like I never noticed the kind of really kind of anti-consumerist bent through that moves through the whole thing, and the fact that these acquisitive parents are kind of suckered in by evil, and evil is the one kind of running the game show that's giving away your brand new kitchen or something like that. How the house is on fire and they want to run back in for their appliances and stuff like that. It's really interesting, and I hadn't as a 8-year-old, I never picked up on that.
And if you think about where he's going in Brazil, then you look at the world that the kid comes from. Yeah. That is a Brazil-like world. I don't know if he would say it's the same world, but it is not. It is a dystopia where the game show Your Money or Your Life is you win, or your husband is literally killed in the pot of custard, right? I did not notice that when I was 9. I think. Well, I do remember being vaguely disturbed by whatever was going. Like the real world, the world that the kid is coming from, is by far the most disturbing of the realms he visits. At least to me. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's something that Gilliam is trying to do on purpose.
Yeah, I think it speaks a little bit to both of you who are much older than me by leaps and bounds. I want to say by at least 2 years. We can speak about these films, and that's one of the things we notice with, say, HATM on the Sunday nights that we end up doing, is that the memory of the films from the films that we watch when we're younger, we simply aren't picking up on some of these messages. And yet those films stay with us, and then we kind of go back, rewatching them time after time after time. And all of a sudden, these films kind of evolve before us as we become more and more, Matt, as you were just talking about, that whole consumerism bent. Last night was my first time watching, and for me, it just stood right out. The parents are sitting there on the couches, everything's wrapped in plastic. They're talking about this, that, and the other, and what their friends, what products their friends have. And I'm like, oh, this is a commentary.
Right.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, this movie has Mycenae, right? This has Robin Hood. These are the history things they're going to talk about, but that's not actually what they're doing. It's a history film, but it's.
Yeah. And it's using history to kind of pull a story in a particular kind of direction while maintaining, a commentary against consumerism. I mean, the kid is the one who is not engaged in consumerism, who is sort of resisting consumerism. And I'm not going to spoil it, but like, at the end, he does get home again, but it is a deeply unsatisfying ending that just kind of a thing happens and then it ends and zooms out and shows the planet.
That's so weird.
It's so weird at the
Oh
end.
my gosh.
It's so weird at the end, yeah. Anyway, it does make more sense when you start thinking about the history and life of Brian and the history in Holy Grail. And then as well, the dystopia of Brazil, which also has a very strange ending. And Baron Munchausen a little more charming, but still engaged in that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I think it's really, and I think the thing about the anti-consumerism is, like, obviously I wasn't paying attention to it at the beginning, but I mean, this is the beginning kind of Reagan and Thatcher, and kind of in the West, this rightward me first kind of the me decade that would become the 1980s and stuff like that. And so this is a real, I think, really punchy political critique that's masked in it. You were saying about kind of Mycenae and Robin Hood, like the places they go, like, are critiques of consumerism as well, right? Like, I mean, so it's a thread that kind of moves through, right? They go to Titanic, and all they're on the Titanic. All the rich people are there, and they're the ones who drown, right? And who are shown, falling off the ship like rats, right? And so it's just kind of continuous throughout. These guys are terrible robbers, and they're finally put back, by the supreme being who basically tells them that he allowed them to do this, but they're not supposed to do this, and they need to give everything back. And then it kind of sets, it's not a happy ending necessarily, but at least, you can follow that thread through, and you can read it as I think a political critique that it was meant to be.
I'm wondering, there's no shortage of time travel movies. So once I, started thinking about Time Bandits and what we're going to watch, and thinking about this film, how does this film maybe kind of compare to, say, other time travel films that you're aware of? Does this have direct comparisons to other things that you can think of? Is this movie doing the same things that other time travel films are doing, or other time travelers making these same kind of arguments or points, or are they just nostalgic in nature?
I mean, I think that because it's refracted through this child, that it has a child's relationship to the past. In a way that is not the same as, taking an adult and placing them in a past situation. And that, in fact, it liberates the film a little bit from trying to, really locate the historical period in a way that then historians can talk about authenticity or whatever else we might talk about. But this is about a child's relationship to the past. This is about, and that is what manifests when he actually travels. He meets, I guess it's Agamemnon, and he saves Agamemnon, and then is going to be adopted as Agamemnon's son, right? It's not trying to, history becomes a venue for a certain kind of storytelling, which, if it had been done one way, would really annoy me. But in this way, as with Holy Grail, as with Life of Brian, as with A Knight's Tale, so it's less to me about the time travel, but about its relationship to the past as a vehicle for storytelling, where no one could take it seriously as, this is what the Middle Ages looked like. No one could, this is what it would be like to actually travel back in time to the Middle Ages. You could not watch the Robin Hood scene and reasonably come away with thinking this is the filmmaker trying to show us that.
And I think it avoids that kind of nostalgia trap that a lot of time travel movies fall into. And I'm thinking, this is a little bit later, but things like Back to the Future, right, in which the past is kind of like this safer, purer place that maybe gets corrupted or something like that. But at least there's some innocence that can be recaptured by going, depending on 1950s or 1850s or whatever. But here, like even in the Robin Hood thing, in which John Cleese plays this kind of buffoonish, Robin Hood, like, his band of merry men are just these miserable thugs who are all idiots, who don't really understand what Robin Hood is kind of doing and giving to the poor, right? There's a scene where he's literally giving kind of riches to the poor, and his merry band is like punching the poor as they're kind of walking through.
Yes, well, there we are. Congratulations. Well done. There we are. Well done. Congratulations. Is that absolutely necessary? Yes. What did he say?
He says, yeah, he's afraid it is.
Ah, fine. There we are, madam. Congratulations. Well done. Jolly good.
And so in every case, like, there's some kind of edge to it. And so it's really saying, as crazy and terrible as that the kid's present is, the past isn't any better in any way, except for Grease. Grease seems pretty cool. He really likes Grease.
Yeah, but so. his wife is going to murder him. We all know it.
Definitely, absolutely,
and it's like the murder is like going to happen within a day, right? Like the murder is right around the corner.
That's fair.
Okay, so there are a couple different things that I'm picking up on here, and I want to come back to both of them. But David, you were kind of talking about this idea that no one's going to confuse Robin Hood and their depiction of Robin Hood in England for that. Are there obligations on the part of like filmmakers? What are your thoughts as far as obligations on films that say take that era seriously to get these things right? We all know that Sean Connery is not actually Greek. Representation in film or depictions. What's the obligation on the part of the filmmaker on, say, maybe not on this film, but like some of the other films you talked about, because you said, okay, this movie I can let slide because it's kind of in jest, right? But I get the sense that there's maybe a line here where you go, okay, this is a more, maybe with a drama, and they're trying to tell the true story of whatever. What are your thoughts on the obligations for representation historically, demographically, so forth?
I mean, I think there's a lot of terrible films that do not take those obligations seriously, but project it as, the true story. I mean, I think there's a lot of terrible books and some of them fiction and some of them nonfiction. I mean, I think that there's and we did this on Historians of the, well, Matt did it. I wasn't able to make it, right? When you ask medievalists, what's your favorite medieval film? You might get Monty Python. And if you don't get Monty Python, you're going to get A Knight's Tale. And A Knight's Tale starts with them literally singing a song by Queen at a joust. So from the first 2 seconds of the film, do not take this seriously as an attempt at historical representation, as opposed to, say, Braveheart, which is fully engaged in this nationalistic myth-making projected as historically authentic, in which is not authentic other than the fact there was a rebellion, like everything about it is not there. And so I think, any film can be sexist or racist or ableist or anything else. And that's true it's certainly true with comedy, and we can engage a film. But in terms of how they reflect the past, I think as soon as if they're signaling parody, it changes the way that we as historians can assess it, which is why, for example, again, right, I started by talking about Medieval, this new film, about a Czech warrior, all filmed through a blue screen, in which when I showed it to my students, they said, "Did you notice that none of the women in the trailer spoke? They just stood there and looked at like things to inspire the men." As opposed to this new film, Catherine Called Birdie by Lena Dunham, not my favorite person, but it has got a sense of play about the Middle Ages that is, it's just much more engaging for me. It's much more interesting to me. I'm much less worried about the work it's doing with the Middle Ages than this film Medieval, which is saying, here is a heroic Christian man, inspired by threats to white Christian women defending, the defending the Czechs against the Easterners, right? That there's just a different kind of relationship to the past there.
I think, if I could tack on to something about David, I think it's part of my sense of what the filmmaker's obligation is to the quote unquote actual past is situational. And I'm thinking, for example, in the medieval sense of the movie Kingdom of Heaven, which was a 2003 film, Ridley Scott, about the Crusades, came out. The filmmaker started to make it shortly after 9/11. Came out kind of either just after the Iraq War, the second Iraq War had started, or just before. I can't remember the exact timing. But anyway, the whole thing was just this weird long meditation about how, religion ruins everything, and why can't we all just kind of get along? And that's fine. And, but I think that it was such a transparent attempt at modern politicking that it came off really poorly, and it gave the wrong impression, because these things do represent, or at least they do seem to present kind of actual versions of the past by the weird things that they do with like prologues and screen text and, historical advisors that, highlighting them in the credits and stuff like that. This is kind of a ham-handed example, but do you guys remember the Da Vinci Code? The book when that came out, right? Like, oh yeah, so the Da Vinci Code, the bane of medievalists for a short period of time. And I remember somebody coming up to me and said, like, the prologue says this book contains facts. Which are the facts? And like Dan Brown knew exactly what he was doing, right? Like, the facts are there's a Louvre and there's a city called Paris, and that's it, really. But he's able to kind of skirt that, and I think some films kind of do that. What David was saying about kind of a Knight's Tale and stuff like that, like they're not trying to do that, and I think that becomes a little bit kind of more safer ground.
And it allows them to do things that in some ways maybe get more at the history of the Middle Ages in ways that we want. Matt and I wrote about The Northman, which is again not. It is a retelling of the story that becomes the basis of Hamlet. And it is a weird film. It is not a comedy, right? So we've mostly talked about sort of comedy. Catherine Called Birdy is a comedy. Knight's Tale is a comedy. Time Bandits is a comedy. This is not a comedy. There's nothing funny about it. It's kind of a horrific film, and about, like Hamlet, right? It's about how violence and how revenge destroys everything. But two, like the filmmaker is playing with a loose boundary between the supernatural and the real. And there are many things about it in which he took great pains, like the material world, to try to make it as authentic as possible at a great expense and with a lot of consultation. But the narrative itself, he does enough work to kind of detach it from a specific kind of historical moment that it worked a lot better for me than even, I liked the show Vikings, but Vikings was trying to say, this is what it was like to be a Viking in a kind of way. It was on the History Channel, for goodness sakes, right? It was on the History Channel. And so I think that show's very problematic in ways that The Northman, which is less real, more weird, might actually get us closer to thinking in useful ways about Viking history than the show Vikings.
I want to go back for a second ago, because we started talking about some of these other time travel films, right? And ways we can use them and think about. The film that kept coming back to my mind when I was watching this film was Bill and Ted. For whatever reason, this film, watching it for the first time, I could just feel its influence all over Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, the two sequels.
Yeah.
I grew up in the time of Back to the Future, as did both of you. And I'm kind of wondering, as scholars, and, David, you're just talking about these teachable moments in these fictional works, right, that we know are fiction. I'm kind of wondering if you have thoughts on why these time travel films themselves are so popular.
I think people like to fantasize about themselves in a different historical context, right? That I do think is fun, and it's fun in books and it's fun in movies. That show about going back to Scotland, that the romance, what do they call
Highlander.
it? No, not Highlander. The romance show. Outlander. There we go.
That's right.
Highlander would also be an excellent 80s film for us to talk about.
Well, it's got Sean Connery, right?
Yeah. You're right.
Also Sean Connery, yeah.
But Outlander, right? That's taking the romance genre, but locating a modern woman in a pre-modern context. In a historical context to engage, and then there's lots of sex in that context. So that's, which I'm I mean, romance is a really important genre and has been for a long time, but that's right. That's the fantasy. And I think, go back in time. Would you be a warrior? What would it like to learn to joust? But in 12th century France, probably short and very painful, for most of us anyway. But I do think that fantasy of leaving the complexities of modern life and going to something that perhaps feels simpler. But that's where the trouble comes in, because simple can often be about gender roles, or simple can often be about racial complexities, or, get out of this whole diversity thing or whatever. And that's when time travel, I think, can get really, really problematic.
Are time travel, I'm pulling a total blank, but time travel movies are almost always going to the past, right? Like, are there?
Yeah, with the exception of maybe, Back to the Future Part 2, which is obviously very much set, in the future, a big portion of that. But yeah, almost all, I want to say, there was the Guy Pearce film, The Time Machine.
Yeah, Time Machine, the H.G. Wells. Yeah.
And I want to say Idiocracy would have been a fast forward in time, right?
Yep.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. Most of them are going to be about traveling to the past to affect some other change in the present, right?
And Buck Rogers. Now there's a time flash forward just to jump back into the 70s now. Buck Rogers in the 25th century, which it's quite possible most of your listeners have literally never heard of. But it really, in the history of sci-fi TV, I think and movies, I do think it has an important place. But I don't know if there's a lot to say about its conception of the future exactly.
Well, I kind of wonder if sci-fi itself then might be kind of conceptualized as some sort of time travel film, especially I'm thinking about Star Trek itself, right? Because Roddenberry's always like, this is the more perfect reality of what we're heading to, right? When we watch Star Trek, we're not thinking of ourselves in the past. We're thinking about this future that's ahead of us. So I'm wondering if someone might conceptualize these films set in the future as some sort of time travel, right? Where we're imposing our own cultural standards now onto another time, only this time maybe in the future itself.
I mean, for sure. And that's probably a different podcast, but it's also one I'm in. I go to science fiction cons and have since I was 15, and I write some science fiction. I'm a failed science fiction writer at this point, although I did sell a story recently. So the one sale, but this is my fandom is in this world. And that's definitely a kind of a deep discourse about how that plays out. But I do think it might be a separate, bigger conversation about in the sci-fi world.
I'm also wondering, right, this idea, you keyed in on this, David, this idea, of time travel and thinking about the past, but also like the idea of choice when we ask ourselves, where would I go? What would I do? And so forth, because we don't choose the world into which we're born into, right? I mean, we're all kind of born into this world. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose the surroundings in which we are given. We kind of work with that. But almost always when I kind of conceptualize, when and where would I live? I would do this, right? And it's based upon whatever either I think is really neat or what benefits me, in my current standing right now. Where would I place myself in time? What is most advantageous? Which brings me to the question I want to ask you guys, which is, could you, if you time traveled, when and where would you go and why?
I have thought long and hard about this, and I would destroy the time machine and refuse to get in it. I'm not going anywhere. I am too much of a fan of things like vaccines, heating, indoor plumbing, stuff like that. I think that when I told people I was doing my PhD, at first they said like, what period would you want to travel back to? And it's just like, it would not be a pleasant thing to go back to medieval Europe in any way, shape, or form, or really anything, any kind of pre-modern society, or even even the 19th century, man, like that just sounded terrible. The living conditions, because I think that oftentimes when people think about time travel or going back in the past, they think they're going to be kind of the elite 1%. In which you could live pretty well, in most periods of time. But the reality is you are not going to be, kind of an elite 1% in almost any situation. So yeah, I would refuse.
Yeah. Which, I think that's the only rational explanation. So reaction. So naturally I have a different one. But I do think it's important in terms of this nostalgia to say, let's be real about the difficulties of these time periods. But if you could guarantee my physical safety, and if you could, and if I knew the languages, I did like that in the Michael Crichton Time Traveler. Like some of them knew Latin, but only one of them knew Occitan, which is the actual language. Like they knew French, but they didn't know Occitan.
Yeah.
Which that's maybe the only detail in that. I haven't seen I think there's a movie. I've only read the book, but that in the book that I liked was that they needed to know the actual vernacular language of Southern France at the time. But
Timeline, I think it was called.
Timelines, yeah. For me, the things that I want to see are cities, because I'm an urban historian, and I want to see Venice in the 13th century, and I want to see Constantinople at almost any moment in its history, though there are key moments. I want to go to Chang'an, or today Xi'an, in what is today Western China, at the moments under the Tang Dynasty, when it was just undisputably the greatest city in the world, in which an entire continent's worth of people and goods and ideas were moving into this city, and then things were happening. Or Baghdad under the Abbasids at the height of the Abbasid power. But of course, all of these cities, including Venice, which is the city I've spent the most time thinking about, were heavily driven by the labor of enslaved people, or semi-enslaved, unfree people with different, the specifics of their legal status vary in time and place in ways that are important to us as historians, but were probably less important to the individuals who were unfree at the time, and that they knew they were unfree. And Rome. I mean, again, there's sort of 4 or 5 moments in Roman history. I'd love to be able to like spend 3 or 4 days safely moving through there and seeing things and watching them and engaging with the sights and smells other than, the feces and things. But I think about when I traveled to cities in the modern era and the way that being physically in a site has changed my understanding in ways that looking at maps and reading texts and looking at pictures just couldn't do. And so I do fantasize about that, but I just think it's important. Matt and I are both very concerned with nostalgia, that we need to understand it as a fantasy, and that the realities would be extremely. It's not just things like toilets and heating and vaccines, but like this morning, it's Monday morning, and when we're recording this, or it's Monday in Minnesota, a truck came by and picked up my garbage and took it away. I mean, that's amazing. That is just, and it used this robot arm to do it. I mean, that is amazing. I like that. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I like that.
I wonder too, I mean, like if I could just muse for a moment, if you don't mind, like I think there's a divide among historians too, right? About like the way that we approach the past. And I think we pretend that we're always doing the same thing, and I don't think we are. Like, I think part of my not wanting to go back is like, I'm okay. Like, I don't need to know. Like, it would be really cool. Like, I've written several pieces about like, what did Urban II, what launched the First Crusade in 1095, sorry, at Clermont. Like, what did Urban say at that speech? Like, what was involved? Who was there? How did the ideas spread? Like, it would be really cool to know. But at a certain level, like, we don't know and we can't know. And like, I'm okay with that. And so I'm wondering if it's a matter of like kind of how we're okay with like certain historians who are just okay with a certain level of uncertainty about the periods that they study, and those who want like kind of like precision, like some kind of economic or military historians who the precision of like how many people and what things happen is very important to how they're structuring their work. I don't know if that is anything, but it does match me not wanting to necessarily go back, I think, with how I approach certain problems in the past, in which we can get to a pretty good answer, but will never be precise, and maybe we need to be okay with that.
Yeah, it sounds to me, what we're talking about really between the two of you is like, Matthew, you're kind of talking about this idea of almost documentation, and David almost like experiential, right? These ideas, two different relationships with the past. One is to know, one is to maybe to do. And I'm very much in the same way. I've always kind of been fascinated with like, say, post-war Los Angeles here in the 20th century, and it really kind of comes from a lot of the fiction I was exposed to, the film noir and so forth really kind of appealed to me. Yeah. And then I think about the things that I want to do, and all I really want to do is go far enough back in time before the fishing grounds were all fished out and just spend a lot of time catching fish. There's nothing historical. I just want to see what I can catch, you know? So I don't know when that would be. I feel like I might get, if I go in the time machine, I'm going to go back millions of years. And, you know, it's like whenever I would tell my students about living in North America 50,000 years ago, you wouldn't make it to your mailbox if you had a house because, you know, the predators and so forth. So I know that if I'm out several million years ago out there trying to fish or whatever, something's going to pick me off, eat the entire boat or something like that. But, you know, hopefully, you know, as long as I get the grip and grin out of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So David, you brought up Timeline, that the film based on the Crichton book, which actually I got to tell you is kind of a guilty pleasure. I'm surprised it hasn't been remade only good this time because
I haven't seen it. I read the book, but I haven't seen it. So
yeah, you're better off for that. I think it's not a good movie. It's just, and it's not that the premise is bad because I like the premise. It's just impossibly. It's just almost poorly cast on almost every single role, except for maybe Gerard Butler, who I think is really good. Almost everything else, it's poorly directed. It's I think Donner directed it, if I recall correctly. But I want to get into like the films on your own specialties. We kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier on about the films that do it right, or maybe just the films that you like, because you know we did Robin Hood on HATM. We've actually done a couple films, a few different films on HATM dealing with the medieval past and so forth. I kind of play around with these ideas. I know that when we talked about the King Arthur film that we did. So I'm kind of wondering if you can each kind of give me 3 films and a book that really kind of work for you, things that you really like.
Let me start with a film and a book, which is unusual in that it's Name of the Rose. That I mean, I love the comedies of the Middle Ages. I love Knight's Tale. I like the King Arthur film I did with you in December. But if I'm looking for something that is trying to be as authentic as possible, it's Name of the Rose. Sean Connery again, to my surprise, but you know, playing a kind of a medieval Sherlock Holmes, but based on this book by Umberto Eco that is just. I mean, it's just an unbelievable book by someone who is an expert in medieval semiotics, an expert in how medieval people understood the world and created symbols and understood symbols. And you know, Umberto Eco is this incredible medievalist who also was able to write this novel that is, and the thing about the novel is that the plot is almost secondary to the novel. The novel is about engage in this medieval world. Whereas in the movie, they then extract the plot and tell it in a really clean and dramatic and exciting way that also works. So that to me, like if there's one medieval film I want to teach and I want to go back to and I want to, and a book I want to read, it's Name of the Rose.
For me, so when I teach with movies quite a bit, you know, just to give people senses of visuals. And although I have lots of problems like with the movie Kingdom of Heaven, I think there are certain set pieces in there which I think are really useful. If you're familiar with the film, if any of the listeners are familiar with the film, like when Legolas, Orlando Bloom, finally arrives in Italy, you know, ready to go to the east. The kind of constant churn of people, the way that the ports had many languages, how there were Muslims and Jews and Christians of various types, people from North Africa kind of moving through. There were ships leaving all the time. It was just a constant movement. And this isn't during kind of one of the Crusades. It's kind of in the space in between. And I think that captures it really well. I really like that scene for that reason. You know, another movie that I really like, not again because because it gets the sense of the medieval period right in a way, is Eric the Viking, which is another you know, kind of Monty Python-esque movie with Tim Robbins playing this kind of doofy Viking guy. And I have no idea who played him, but one of my favorite characters is kind of the hapless Christian missionary in the community who has never converted a single person. And everybody just kind of tolerates him as like he's this weirdo who's kind of off on the side, and they kind of put up with him and stuff like that. But it's about Vikings. It's about Viking culture. And I think it gets things right in a really interesting way about the relationship between certain Viking communities and the wider world. You know, their ideas about kind of Norse mythology, the weird on and offness of Christianization, I think in that period as well, I think is really, really neat and interesting. Plus, it's just a weird, funny movie. And then finally about the book, you know, I don't have a kind of novel, though No, that's not true. I'm going to do 2 books. I'm going to cheat. One is a nonfiction, one is a novel, and I can't believe I didn't think of this immediately. But the nonfiction, other than The Bright Ages by Matthew Gabriele and David Perry, which is a great overview of medieval Europe, is there's a graphic history of the Middle Ages by Eleanor Janega, which is just really phenomenal. It's funny, but it's so learned and so interesting in the way that it's presenting medieval Europe, and it's really wonderful. The novel I would say is The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I just absolutely love. And the kind of Arthur is a backstory. It's set in early medieval England. There's kind of this magical element as well, but it's just such a heartbreaking story about kind of the dangers of nostalgia, even in the medieval period as it remembers itself, but then about family and other things as well. So, and it really kind of captures A, this idea of the importance of nostalgia, but B, again, kind of the landscape, the way that communities kind of interacted with each other, and the way that the environment could shape those relationships.
Yeah, another novel from the Middle Ages, which again I sort of wasn't thinking about, but we have a friend named Bruce Holsinger who wrote this novel called A Burnable Book, and then a sequel, The Invention of Fire, in which John Gower more or less plays a detective in this very chaotic moment in late 14th century London. And they're brilliant books. I think they're both just exceptional books by someone who knew enough to do everything right, but also knew enough about literature to make sure that he could tell the stories he wanted to tell. And I think they're great. I was thinking about like films with these parts. I often show the first 12 minutes of The 13th Warrior, which is not a good book, and I would argue is not a good movie. But the first 12 minutes, it dramatizes this scene in which we have a medieval text of a guy named Ibn Fadlan who encounters a people called the Rus, basically on the Volga, and he says they're really dirty, but also really noble, and they love their women. Although here's a scene of gang rape and ritual murder, and they in the morning they pass a bowl around and they wash their face and they gargle and they blow their nose in and they pass it to the next person. That is in the text, this Arabic text, and it is dramatized in the movie in a way that I'm thrilled it exists because I teach with it all the time. Similarly, but in reverse, in Kingdom of Heaven, there's this incredibly important battle, the Battle of Hattin. It is the battle in which the military strength of the Crusader states is broken by Saladin and his army. It's one of the most pivotal battles in the history of the Latin kingdoms of the Levant. And Kingdom of Heaven shows them riding out to it, and then it shows their corpses. And it doesn't do the movie. Now, the movie would have cost $50 million. I mean, the battle might have cost $50 million to make. I don't know. But we have multiple sources from multiple perspectives describing every move or many moves of that battle, like we have for Gettysburg, right? It's one of these battles that we have a lot of perspectives on. And I just want someone to take $50 million and do it perfectly for 20 minutes so I can show it in class and say, this is, read the source, look at this film, try to open up your imagination a little bit to what it would have been like on a medieval battlefield. And that to me is one of the places where even if it's just a moment, a scene, a 12-minute snip, a scene of a port, as a teacher, if we can find these visual moments to pull, I'm really excited about doing that.
Jason, you've opened a Pandora's box because everything that everybody's saying is like making me think about more. And I don't know how I didn't mention The Green Knight too as a film.
Right.
Oh my God, what a phenomenal movie that was. And it's so good and it's so well done and it's so perfectly shot. And the thing is, like, as weird as it is, and it's a super weird movie, the story is weirder. Like, that's the thing. Yeah. It's like they toned it down, and it just does such an amazing job kind of capturing the weirdness of the story, but kind of the landscape and kind of the mental world of the what's known as the Gawain poet, in the later Middle Ages.
And there's, the Middle Ages does have a lot of weirdness, and there's one tendency to say, ooh, weird, or alien weird. And none of those are good. That the weirdness is actually, for me as a medievalist, a pathway towards engaging their humanity and their shared humanity with us. Like the weirdness is actually a point of access, not a point of alienation. And I thought the Green Knight and in other ways, the Northmen as well, both did that. As opposed to Saladin in Kingdom of Heaven is just and certainly Orlando Bloom's character, they're just kind of modern guys in medieval clothing who are talking about multiculturalism. And that's much less interesting to me as a historian.
Yeah.
You guys brought up Green Knight. I'm kind of wondering about your thoughts, specifically in relation to maybe Dev Patel's character there, as far as his casting and how that relates to maybe the Arthurian legend. How does Patel's casting affect the story of that?
My friends who talk about England this period talk about it as an island full of immigrants. And yes, those immigrants were not from South Asia, but not in this alleged period of Arthurian myth, though there's plenty of actually people moving in and out of England in the 5th century. But if you think about it as a 13th century, 14th century English narrative, then this is an island in which lots of people from a long way away are coming in and staying and moving. And that if by taking a modern, looking from a modern population that has immigrated into England, from in this case from South Asia, that there's a kind of authenticity to that. But also, I think that it's worth disrupting the notion of the white European Middle Ages. I mean, it's just I think there's a historical justification from people for whom the status of England in this period really matters. It does not matter to me, and I'm an Italianist. I'm not. England is this little island over there. It's not. I'm not deeply caught up in its history more than other places. But I do think that it's just worth disrupting this narrative of the white Middle Ages as much as possible, because that is not what medieval Europe looked like. And even in a particular spot where it might have been what it looked like, it was not what the mental world looked like. And it was complicated because the mental world may be more diverse, but also include things that we could think of as the what's called, Geraldine Hung calls this other scholar the invention of race or race thinking, right? So it's not like, well, they had people who weren't white and then they all loved each other, right? It's a complicated history, as we might expect. But I think that if Dev Patel's casting engages that history and pushes back at myths of kind of homogeneity, that I'm all for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story about a giant, 8-foot tall knight who's made out of moss and has his head cut off and then puts it back on. So, if people are getting upset, I mean, I think one of the things about, the quote unquote controversy about, Dev Patel's casting, it gets caught up with, as we've seen with the Rings of Power show on Amazon or House of Dragon, right? You can't have black elves or something like that. It's just a bunch of racist assholes being racist. It's just, they're using kind of quote unquote historical accuracy. And unfortunately, this often connects back to their visions of a pure white medieval Europe. But they're just using, this kind of pretend care about historical fidelity, to make their racist points. And they could do it in any number of ways, but this seems to give them legitimacy. And I think that's actually something. I mean, David and I take a lot of time to point out is that this is a repertoire. Middle Ages have been, or the European Middle Ages have been, kind of a reservoir of justification for white supremacy for a really long time, and that. Some of the things that they're pulling on are factually true, but they're matters of analysis that we as good scholars can push back on and should push back on because it's not the full picture and it's not even kind of the real picture about what's going on.
Yeah, I thought Patel was actually really inspired casting. And there are a couple different reasons for this, but the thing that keeps coming back is we're talking about our connections between history and film. We've said Sean Connery's name about 44 times. And of course, Patel is one of these guys whose name you continually hear as a possibility for the new Bond films. And it seems to be, Bond himself kind of is a stand-in perhaps for this other national myth of the British Empire, say post-World War II, or something along those lines, at least to me, So it's interesting that it continues to come up. There's pushback about, and of course you still hear the same pushback. Can't have Patel. You can't have Idris Elba. And so forth.
Because James Bond was real somehow, and yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
No, he's great. I think it'd be great. I mean, I think we could live in a world without James Bond movies, but I understand that people in Hollywood like to make enormous piles of money by making James Bond movies. So in that context, I think Dev Patel would be great.
You guys started hitting on this just a second ago, but I was kind of wondering, and maybe kind of as we're kind of getting towards the end here, but it's like, what's at stake in getting the story of the Middle Ages right? Or, why do I in 2022 here in South Florida care about what happened in Italy or in England in 1019? Why is that important? Why do I need to know this? What's at stake here?
Wow, that's a large question. But I think it's a really.
I can take it if you want. I can take it if you want, Matt. I just thought you'd be ready to jump right on that.
No, I mean, I think let me. I'll just say like a couple words, and then I'll let David, take it from me. I think the biggest reason is because the Middle Ages right now in the 21st century, meaning sitting here in 2022, and for the last 5-7 years, is that it has been very much at the forefront of the political and cultural consciousness, not just through kind of pop culture evocations, Vikings, Game of Thrones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but also kind of in the way that it's been used to make arguments for a particular kind of politics and a particular kind of history for what the United States or kind of the quote unquote West, which is another really problematic concept, ought to be. Is that it's a source of legitimacy. And so the stakes of kind of getting the Middle Ages right, not just kind of in a pedantic way, but in a way of understanding, like, why are people telling the stories that they are about the Middle Ages? How have they influenced things? And how do we escape kind of that really troubling trap that a lot of people have fallen into, are pressing for where we go in the future?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I would say that all periods are worth trying to tell the best stories we can about, and that no particular history is more important than any other history. On the other hand, as we say, I think the language, I'm actually pretty sure Matt wrote this. There's a way that we tend to just both claim credit for everything and also blame the other one for everything, except for the dad jokes, which are all Matt's fault. But
100% mine in the book.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All Matt's fault. But Matt talks about the ways in which the European Middle Ages persistently intrude into 21st century life, and 21st century life in terms of our media, our movies we watch, right? Like there are 17th and 18th century movies, but it is not the same as an ancient Roman movies. It is just not the same as a generative space for fiction as the European Middle Ages in terms of what is grabbing people, right? These two shows, Rings of Power, House of the Dragon, both medievalist in structure and complicated and problematic ways, right? These are huge shows right now. And that's not, the Three Musketeers shows, which would be another, are not as huge shows. The pirate shows, which are another period, they're fun, but they're just not, right? There's something about the ways in which the European Middle Ages still shapes the 21st century imagination in fiction. And then in politics, and and there's different ways that it happens in Europe, where there's kind of this, direct, like, the thing happened here. So then that, that's different than in the US, but very powerfully in the US as well. And so, I think there's a real obligation, at least of medievalists, to do this work and tell this story and present it in ways that people can access, that people can even access very casually, right? That they have 5 minutes to sort of look at something and get a thought, that journalists can access, that other historians who, like you, teach North America, you might spend 20 minutes in a survey class on the European Middle Ages. And I want to give you the best 20 minutes that I can to pick up on so that you enter your period with something that's a little more grounded. And I just think that's really important work. I became a journalist to talk about disability. And my son has Down syndrome. He's autistic. I'm also disabled. Other people in my family are disabled. I really wanted to talk about disability. That's why I became a journalist while being a history professor. That was my plan. And then just the European Middle Ages in particular entered news cycle after news cycle. For me, starting with, there's the war on terror that was laden with this, but then it really picked up for me as a writer with the retirement of the Pope, which everyone got wrong in 2012, and has just continued. That the European Middle Ages just shows, I'm a freelance journalist, so my job is to identify a news cycle and pitch an editor who doesn't care and ask them to pay me. And just the European Middle Ages again and again is right there in the news cycle. And I didn't expect that even as a medievalist, but it's just sort of undeniable based on my career.
You guys picked out Time Bandits. Is Time Bandits a history movie?
I think Time Bandits is a movie that plays with history in order to present a number of different kinds of satires sort of contemporary values and contemporary to the 80s, but contemporary values and contemporary lives in ways that Monty Python always did, right? Everything they did was about sort of lampooning the now in the great tradition of the best sketch comedy, but that they used history as a way to do it. And that they did it successfully enough that as a historian, even when they do the Middle Ages, I find it enjoyable. And I laugh. And I laughed when I watched it with my 13-year-old daughter. And my 13-year-old daughter laughed too, even here in 2012. So I feel, or 2022. So I feel like that's pretty good.
You're playing with time yourself.
I know. Yeah, I think so. And I think just pretty much to echo what David was saying, I think it is a history movie. I think in two senses: is that one, it's a cultural artifact of the early 1980s, sure. But also it's a movie about the past and about the stories that we tell about the past and how those things are not always true to life. Is that the reality is much more complicated? Is that although the main character, I don't even know, does the boy even have a name?
Kevin.
Okay, that's right, Kevin. Kevin, even though Kevin is kind of their guide throughout, is that he's shown reading history books kind of at the beginning, like the reality of meeting Napoleon, meeting Robin Hood is a little bit different than what he was expecting. Is that it's a little bit more messy and never quite as kind of great as he thinks it is or thinks it's going to be. And so so I think that's a really interesting way to think about the past and something that Gilliam and the Monty Python troupe, who apparently, studied, medieval history at, was it Cambridge? I think,
I don't know,
Oxford, somewhere. Anyway, I think they all studied history. I used to know this better when I was talking about it more, but I'm sure they picked up, and it's something I think that's really instructive for how we think about the past even today.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so very much. I can't thank you enough for both being here and also forcing me to watch this film that I sat there for 2 hours on a bumpy flight from Baltimore to Fort Lauderdale, wishing I had gone by steamship, railroad, horseback, anything other than a plane last night. But I ended up having a blast watching this and getting to talk to you guys. So I can't thank you both enough for this. Where can we find you guys online? Where are you guys on Twitter?
For complicated reasons, my handle is @LollardFish. It involves 15th century heretics. I'm not going to go into it. But also davidmperry.com is a great way to locate me.
And I'm at Prof. Gabriel, PROF_Gabriel on Twitter, and then Prof. Gabriel without the _.com as well. So, and you can always find us every once in a while at Historians at the Movies on Sunday nights.
Well, guys, thank you both so very, very much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. That was a lot of fun.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guests, Dr. David Perry and Dr. Matthew Gabriel. And of course, thank you to our avid, amazing, awesome producer, Fletcher Powell, who I could not do this podcast without. Thank you all for being here each and every week. HATM Podcast is created by me, Jason Herbert. You can find me on Twitter at @HerbertHistory. And you can join in every Sunday night on Historians at the Movies by looking for the hashtag HATM and join in because it's a lot of fun. So keep coming along, share this podcast, share HATM, and share the good times, everybody. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Bye.